The story begins with a young writer named Dan who is walking in downtown London. He sees a young and beautiful woman named Alice walking opposite to his direction. They make eye contact and smile together. Alice is not used to the road in the UK, so she looks at the wrong direction and got hit by a car. Dan runs towards her, and she looks at him saying hello. She got some cuts and bruises, but other than that, she is fine. When they leave the hospital, they pass by a park which Dawn has memories from when he was a child. They also pass by a wall which has names of different people who have sacrificed their lives to save others. They ride the bus and continue chatting. Dan says that he wants to become a real writer and currently he is writing for obituaries. Alice, on the other hand, is a stripper from New York. She went to London so she could escape her bad relationship. When they arrive at Dan's office, he bids farewell and turns around to leave. Alice asks him if he has a girlfriend, and he answers yes. 1 year has passed. Dan is in a photo shoot where his photo is being taken by Anna. Dan and Alice have already been living together and he has written a book about his life with Alice and his photo shoot is for the cover of this book. Anna is a photographer from America who likes taking portrait photos of strangers. Dan and Anna are chatting, and Anna reveals that she and her husband are currently separated. She also confesses that she likes reading his books. Dan moves closer and kisses her. Anna remembers that Dan already has a partner that he wrote a book for, so she pushes him away. Dan tells her that he likes her and wants to date her, but she rejects him and tells him to move on. Alice arrives to meet Dan. She just finished her job at a coffee shop. Dan brings her to the studio where she meets Anna. Alice then asks her to take her photo and Dan then leaves them both. While taking her photo, Alice tells her that she heard the conversation she had with Dan through the intercom downstairs. Alice walks out and Anna apologizes. Alice replies crying, telling her to just take her picture. That evening, Dan is in front of his laptop. He is chatting with somebody and pretends to be a woman as a prank. The man he is chatting with is named Larry. He works as a dermatologist and has an abnormal sex addiction. He asks his chatmate for her name, to which Dan replies, Anna. They continue chatting intimately until Dan asks Larry to meet in person. He tells him to meet at the aquarium. The next day, Larry goes to their meeting place and coincidentally, the real Anna is there. He talks to her, and they find out that Dan played a prank on him. He gets embarrassed but she seems to like him, and they started dating. 4 months have passed, and Dan and Alice are preparing to go to the photo exhibit of Anna. Dan is planning to go to his father's funeral after the exhibition. Alice asks him if she could go and support him, but he rejects her saying he wants to go alone. At the photo exhibit, Alice sees her portrait when she was crying. While looking at it, Larry joins her and flirts with her. He then introduces himself as the boyfriend of Anna. On the other side, Dan and Anna are talking and Dan still obviously likes Anna. Anna shares how she and Larry meet and how Dan is their Cupid. Dan confesses that his book failed, and he is back to writing obituaries. After the exhibit, Dan takes Alice to a taxi as he will be heading to the funeral right after. But Dan actually just stayed and talked with Anna. Another year has passed. Dan arrives in his apartment. At first, he tells Anna that he went to a business dinner, but later admits that he is actually seeing Anna. He further confesses that they are having an affair which started a year ago at Anna's photo exhibit. Meanwhile, Anna and Larry are now married. Larry has just returned from a business trip and greets his wife with a hug. Later, he quietly admits that he was unfaithful during the trip and spent a night with a working girl. Anna doesn't seem shaken at first, but then confesses that she's also been unfaithful. She's been involved with Dan. Larry is furious. He asks her why she even agreed to marry him if she was still seeing Dan. Anna explains that she tried to break things off with Dan when Larry proposed, but somehow, it happened again. Larry then demands every detail of her time with Dan, and Anna tells him everything. Hearing it all only makes Larry more furious, and he ends up throwing her out of the house. Back at Dan's place, Alice is heartbroken. She cries as Dan tries to comfort her and pleads for forgiveness. But Alice doesn't say a word. She walks out of his apartment without telling him where she's going. 6 months pass. Larry is now often seen drinking alone at a strip club. One night, he spots Alice back on stage, dancing once again. He asks for a private room and she agrees. Inside, she plays along with his flirtation and introduces herself as Jane Jones. Larry, curious and hurting, keeps asking her what her real name is, but every time, she gives the same answer, Jane Jones. Larry, still bitter about his split with Anna, becomes even more upset by Alice's playful and evasive behavior. He tells her that he loves her and wants to be with her, but she says no. Still, when he asks her to dance again, she does as he says. A few months later, Anna and Dan cross paths again at a concert. She apologizes for arriving late, and they sit together for a drink. Dan admits that he hasn't looked for Alice. Anna, in return, shares that earlier that day, she had met Larry to sign the divorce papers. She explains that just before signing, Larry kissed her and asked her for one last time together. Dan asks if she went through with it, and she says yes. She tells him that Larry wouldn't agree to sign unless she gave in. Dan is hurt and quiet. Some time later, Dan suddenly storms into Larry's office. He says he wants Anna back, but Larry tells him that Anna has already left Dan and returned to him. Dan is stunned when Larry reveals that Anna never even filed the divorce papers. Larry goes on to say that Anna always seems drawn to sadness, and that maybe happiness just doesn't suit her. That's why, he claims, she ended up back with him. He also says that Anna never truly loved Dan, she only wanted the thrill. Dan begins to cry. Larry, surprisingly calm, tells Dan to go back to Alice. He says he saw her again, working at a club. He swears he didn't do anything with her and even gives Dan the address. Dan thanks Larry for being honest. But just as Dan is about to leave, Larry stops him and smirks. He confesses that he lied, he actually did sleep with Alice. Dan follows the address and heads to the strip club. He spots Alice dancing under the lights. She sees him too. Without a word, she walks toward him. Later, the two are seen together in a hotel room, talking and smiling. Alice shares that she plans to go back to New York and asks Dan to come with her. They think back to the moment they first met 4 years ago. Dan suddenly asks her if she ever slept with Larry. Alice says no. But Dan doesn't believe her. He says he wants the truth. He steps outside to get a cigarette and tells her that when he returns, he expects an honest answer. Moments later, Dan walks back in holding a flower and hands it to Alice. But her mood has shifted. She quietly tells him that he doesn't love her anymore. She says she just realized she's stopped loving him too, because he keeps pushing about Larry. She finally admits the truth. She did sleep with Larry that night they saw each other at the club, and she enjoyed it. Dan replies that he already knew. Larry told him everything, but he says it doesn't matter anymore. He forgave her because he still loves her. Alice, however, wants him to leave. Dan refuses and continues pressing. He asks why she did it. She answers that she simply wanted to. She felt drawn to Larry. Dan, overwhelmed with emotion, slaps her. Later, Alice is shown at the airport in New York, alone. When she hands over her passport, it reveals her real name, Jane Jones, the same name she gave Larry back at the strip club. Back in London, Dan walks past the park where he first met her. He stops at the wall with the engraved names of heroes. One name stands out, Alice Ayres. That's the name Alice had been using all along. Dan is hit with a quiet sadness. The film ends with Jane, or Alice, walking down a crowded street in New York by herself, while men glance at her as she passes.